Welcome to Uncomfortable Conversations about Culture and Christianity. My name is Alex, and today I am joined by Dr. Randy Adkins. He is a political science professor. I'll let you introduce yourself so I don't botcher all that today. But obviously, we are a few weeks away from an election, presidential election this year, and everyone's got their yard sign. Not everyone, but a lot of people. Those yard signs are popping up everywhere. Ads are on, probably even on this YouTube video. If you're watching this on YouTube, it is everywhere. We're swimming in it. And so we thought it'd be fun to just have somebody that knows a lot more about this than I do on the podcast and talk about it. So, Randy, will you introduce yourself? Dr. Adkins, I apologize. Introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us just who you are, some maybe personal stuff, and then we'll get into why in the world you went into this field of political science.
Yeah. Well, you can call me Randy. That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm going to call you Alex. And,
Great.
And that's how we know each other. So I guess what I tell people in terms of introducing myself is that my great-grandfather was a coal miner. My grandfather was a blacksmith who worked for the coal mines. My father worked for a pipe and valve distributor that supplied the coal mines. Now, they grew up in West Virginia. I grew up in West Virginia. I did not grow up anywhere near the coal mines. I grew up in town.
Okay.
But my parents did something really cool, which was they bought a house that was a block away from a public library and a block away from a public school. And what that did was it fostered in me a desire understand the importance of public education, and then also the importance of public service. And so those are two things that I hold to be sort of very dear and critical values to me. Other than that, I'm a political science professor. I'm a husband. I'm a dad. I've spent my time, coaching my kids and spent my time in church and things like that. So, I'm just a normal person other than that.
Yeah. And around this time of year, especially probably every 4 years, you're a very popular guy. Even in our walking up here, you're like, people keep calling me and wanting interviews. And so I'm just grateful that you're jumping on here to talk to us today.
Yeah. It's a little interesting this year because we have three very competitive races here in Nebraska that are all centered around, or two of the three are centered around Omaha.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people in the country, across the country, and a lot of people actually in the world are paying attention to what's going on in Nebraska.
That's wild. Yeah, I'm not shortage of phone calls and text messages of people wondering who I'm voting for these days.
Yeah.
So obviously you have those values that you shared. So what got you into specifically political science, politics, and wanting to be engaged in this kind of world?
Yeah, it's, if I go back to when I was a high school student, so I'm a first generation college student.
Okay.
And so my parents didn't have a lot of advice to give me other than they told me, you are going to college. We didn't get a chance to do this, but we're going to make sure you get an opportunity to do it. And so, like a lot of kids, I tested really well in math and science, and somebody said, oh, you should go down the pre-health route. Maybe you could be a doctor or a physical therapist or something like that. But I was also working my way through school. And, I'd get off work at 10 o'clock at night, and I just didn't find that I wanted to sit up and do calculus and chemistry and physics problems, until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I just didn't have a passion for that. And so I ended up, just having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I said, I think I've got to change my major because I'm not liking my classes at all. And he said to me, you should be a lawyer. And I said, a lawyer? Why do you think I should be a lawyer? And he said, you're really good at arguing. And I said, I'm not really good at arguing. Of course, that was more of a joke that I was making at the time. But I was like, what do you major in to be a lawyer? And of course, at the time, you can major in anything to be a lawyer. But at the time, everybody said political science. And so I went and took a political science class. And interestingly, the political science class that I took, because I was working, was a night class. And it was taught by the district coordinator for the local member of Congress. And so and he was great in the classroom. And so I sort of got a little bit of a bug from that. And then I took another class the next semester, and that was taught by the person who ended up being my undergraduate mentor, Simon Perry, there at Marshall University. And he was a fantastic teacher. I could only aspire to be as good a professor in the classroom as he was. And what he ended up doing was, without really trying to do it, he convinced me to become a political scientist instead of being a lawyer.
Okay.
And so I decided to become a professional political scientist, which meant I had to go to grad school. And so he was instrumental in helping me get into grad school. And then, I had a couple jobs before I came here to Omaha, both in academics. One was in southern West Virginia, and another was in southwestern Pennsylvania. But my wife and I moved to the Midwest like 25 years ago because we ended up finding jobs that were close to each other.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So are there specific areas in the political science? I mean, for those people like me that are very ignorant to all of this, what does that mean? I know words like politics, I know science, but what does that field look like? And are there specific areas that you really are passionate about?
Yeah. So, the Professional Association basically breaks it down into 4 areas. So the first one would be like political theory. So if I was interested in Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and things like that, I would study political theory. That's not my passion. A second area would be studying the governments of the world. So I grew up in West Virginia. I'd never traveled abroad. So when I was an undergraduate, that wasn't something that really sparked my interest. International relations. Now that, he was talking about foreign policy, things like that. That starts to get a little interesting to me. But the thing that was the most interesting to me was the study of American politics. And, separation of powers, checks and balances, the political institutions, campaigns and elections. And that was what excited me out of all the different things that I could have taken in terms of coursework as an undergrad. And so when I went into grad school, I basically, my application said, I want to study American politics. And fortunately, they wanted a student who wanted to study American politics, and they funded me to come. So that's how I ended up doing what I do. And I like to think I've been pretty successful at it. I'm still doing it. So that's probably the most important thing.
Yeah, that is important. So you were not from Nebraska.
No.
And Nebraska kind of, especially in an election like this, it's talked about, which is kind of strange to me growing up in Nebraska, knowing we have, I believe, 5, electoral votes. Not a lot, on the line for Nebraska, but there are some uniquenesses about us versus a lot of other states in the country. And so one of those is that we have a unicameral system. And so for those that don't understand, like me, I mean, I like to try to act like I understand. I took the Capitol tour when I was in 4th grade, probably like many Nebraskans, and did all those things. But can you explain to us just what that means, why Nebraska is different and how they're different, maybe how we chose, this system versus other systems that states have?
Yeah. So 49 out of 50 states have a bicameral legislature. So that means that there's both a House and a Senate. And those are intentional because they're meant to mimic the United States Congress. In Nebraska, we still have a separation of powers between the legislature and the executive. We still have checks and balances between the legislature and the executive. But what we don't have is we don't have 2 separate legislatures within the legislature. We don't have 2 chambers. Now, interestingly, if you go down to the state capitol, there is a second chamber. It's just not used. Because the state capitol, the construction of it predates the time that we moved to a unicameral legislature.
Gotcha.
So I think it's called is it called the Warner Room? That sounds familiar to me. I know I've been in it. I think they hold some events in it. But anyway, it dates back to like the 1930s. Actually, it probably dates as far back as the 19-teens. There was a study that was done, maybe I'm going to say 1913. It was commissioned by the legislature to look for efficiencies in government. And one of the things that commission came up with was developing a unicameral legislature. And so, they tried to get it passed. And I want to say they got tried like 4 or 5 times, and the legislature failed to approve it each time. So it didn't become law because the legislature had the power to do that on their own. But they just decided not to do it. And then United States Senator George Norris, who was a progressive Republican, and yes, I know for some people they're thinking, the word progressive doesn't go with. They think that, but you're going back to the 1920s and 1930s, and the political parties were a little different back then. So you had liberal and conservative Republicans, you had liberal and conservative Democrats, and we really don't have that today. The political parties are much more homogenous. But he was a progressive Republican. He actually sided with FDR on a lot of things. But one of the things he thought we should do is we should have a unicameral legislature. So he went around the state of Nebraska and got people to sign the initiative, sign the petition for the initiative to be on the ballot, to be a constitutional amendment to change the way the legislature is constructed in the state of Nebraska. And they say he wore off 2 sets of tires on his car.
Wow.
Just driving around the state of Nebraska, doing that. But he basically was a one-man campaign to change the unicameral. Now, the reason he thought that was important was because he thought that the influence of interest groups in the 1920s was very predominant in the bicameral Nebraska legislature. And he thought that if we went from a bicameral system to a unicameral system where we only have the 49 senators or whatever, that would make it much more difficult for those interest groups to have an influence over the state senators. The other thing that came out of it was our nonpartisan system of electing our state senators. So, as everybody in Nebraska knows, when you run for state senate, you don't run under a party label. Your name appears on the ballot. It doesn't say Democrat or Republican next to it. Now, all those senators have a party label. They're identified as partisans. Maybe they're Democrat, Republican, or nonpartisan, but they don't run as that. And they end up sort of semi-caucusing in the legislature that way once they get there. But surprisingly, they do end up crossing party lines on a number of things. And because of the smaller nature of the legislature, there's probably more cooperation that goes on in our legislature than you would see in bicameral legislatures.
Okay. So I would assume that's one of the advantages we would say is a part of the unicameral system. Are there other advantages that we think are still there, or are people actively saying this is dumb? 49 other states are doing it one way and we're doing it another. I guess historically there.
I take Norris's point very well because, if you had let's say you've got a state senate with 49 senators and you've also got another 100 people in a House of Delegates or a House of Representatives at the state level. That means that interest groups now have 150 access points to people instead of having 50 access points to people. So it probably diminishes the influence of interest groups within our state legislature in that sense.
Gotcha.
So Norris was probably right. There might be other ways where it actually increases it, but I take Norris's point because just having fewer people means that there are fewer access points to that policymaking process from interest groups. And so the other thing that he was really concerned about where that access point actually in part occurred was in the conference committees. In a legislature, in a bicameral legislature, you've got to pass the same bill in both houses. So that language has to be identical. If it's not, it goes to a conference committee to get that language ironed out.
Gotcha.
And there was a lot of lobbying that was going on in the conference committees that didn't end up in the dialogue that was going on the House and Senate floor. And so, but if you eliminate the bicameral nature, you eliminate the conference committee. So all the dialogue ends up happening on the floor.
I'm just curious, what did interest groups, what were the kind of interest groups 100 years ago that we were kind of like, oh, we got to watch out for those? Do you have any clue versus like what that looks like now?
Well, when we think about it now, I think a lot of people, if I were to survey my students in the class and I would say, everybody name an interest group, most likely every one of them is going to name a public interest group. So they're going to talk about, groups based on sex or groups based on race or groups based on, ownership of guns or groups based on, certain rights.
Yeah, that's where my mind's going.
Yeah, that's where your mind goes. But do you realize that at the state and the federal level, that interest groups have to register to lobby the government? And when you look at the groups that are registered to lobby the government, there are more businesses or corporations that are registered to lobby than anything else.
Wow.
So, you think about it, here in Omaha, we have some Fortune 500 companies like, Union Pacific. Do you think Union Pacific lobbies the federal and the state government?
I'm guessing so.
Yeah, absolutely they do. Absolutely they do. In fact, they have a whole government relations office. They call it government relations in their business, but it's lobbying. And so that's what they do. And so a lot of it is corporates. It is corporate lobbying. A little bit of it's union, some of it's public interest groups, but the largest number is going to be corporate.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So another uniqueness of Nebraska is we can split our electoral votes. So most of the states, whichever way the populace goes, then the electoral vote just automatically all the points they go to that person. And so Nebraska is obviously unique in this. And I think who is the other state? One other state, right? Maine. Nebraska and Maine are unique in this. And so what's unique about this, especially for like a small dog state, five votes, that's all we get. Well, why is that so unique? And also, what's the big deal about splitting it, because I know the last few elections, it's been a big deal. You've got all these blue dots, red dots, and sprinkled across people's yards these days. And so what makes it unique and why is it a big deal, I guess?
Yeah. So, if you look at, I think I heard this the other day. I haven't looked it up myself, but I think it's true. 7 of the last 8 election cycles, more people voted for the Democratic presidential nominee than the Republican presidential nominee.
Overall
in the
across
country.
Okay.
But in 2 of those cycles, the Electoral College went to the person who didn't win the popular vote. That would be 2000. It went to George W. Bush, and in 2016, it went to Donald Trump. And there's a strong possibility that could happen again this year. Mm-hmm. So that would be 3 times out of 9 possibly that something like that could happen. When that kind of thing begins to happen, people start to think, should we reform this thing called the Electoral College? And so, we've heard a number of different proposals to reform the Electoral College. Like a number of years ago, Colorado had a plan to split their votes proportionally. Just like if you got 55% of the vote, you'd get 5, and they had 9. And if you got 45% of the vote, you get 4.
Gotcha.
Okay. So that's one way to do it. But we do it here in Nebraska, and Maine does it the same way by just allocating 2 of those votes to whoever gets the statewide popular vote. And then the remaining votes are allocated by whoever wins the popular vote within that district. So Maine has 4 votes. So that's 2 plus 2. Mm-hmm. Nebraska has 5 votes. That's 2 plus 3. And, when this was originally passed in Nebraska, the thought was it was going to increase the visibility of Nebraska among presidential candidates. Presidential candidates would start to pay attention. Nebraska would become important. Now, this is passed in like 1991. So 1992 is the first election cycle where this happens. Nobody's paying attention to this, in Nebraska or in Maine. And Maine had passed it 20 years before. Nobody was paying attention to it until 2008. And the reason nobody was paying attention to it was that there just wasn't enough campaign money in the system to compete for one Electoral College vote in Maine or Nebraska. But in 2008, Barack Obama at that time raised more money than anybody had ever raised in terms of running for president. And he had a tremendous advantage over his opponent, John McCain. It was like a 3 or 4 to 1 advantage in terms of fundraising. And so, his campaign manager, David Plouffe, was like, I think I just want to go compete for the 1 vote in Nebraska, and I'm just going to do it for fun. And I think Obama, in Plouffe's book, Obama said, well, as long as it doesn't come down to 1 vote in Nebraska, I'm okay with that. And it didn't, and it didn't come down that way in 2016 either. It wasn't 1 vote in Nebraska, and it hasn't happened with Maine. But there are scenarios this year where it could come down to the 1 vote in Nebraska. As many of the listeners know, there's 7 battleground states right now, and 3 of those are in the Rust Belt, and the other 4 are in the Sun Belt. And if Harris takes the 3 in the Rust Belt and Trump takes the 4 in the Sun Belt, then all of a sudden you've got a scenario that is, 270 to 268, depending on what happens in Nebraska too.
Yeah, which is wild to think about. This little state in the middle of Nebraska could have that sort of.
Yeah. Not only is it just like one little district, in the middle of Nebraska, but if you look at the maps, the Electoral College maps, you're talking about Iowa, South Dakota, Kansas, Missouri. These are red states. I mean, this is like right in the middle of a whole series of red states. And there is this one district that is drawn in such a way, and the eccentricity of the state's system for allocating electors would allow it to go to, possibly the candidate that's not going to win the rest of that area.
How do you think if other states, or if every state adopted, Nebraska's how we do that, how we split them, how do you think that would fundamentally change, one, how elections happen, but also, how people are trying to campaign in all these places? Do you think it would fully, fundamentally just change everything if we went to that in 4 years? Or do you think it'd be a progressive, slow type of
Oh, no,
change?
it would dramatically change the way we do things. Let me mention that Washington Post did a study of this back in like 2015, 2016.
Okay.
And one of the things they found, looking from 1992 to 2016, is there was one election cycle where it would have changed the outcome. And it would have been 2012.
Gotcha.
In 2012, Mitt Romney won more congressional districts than Barack Obama did.
Okay.
But in every other congressional district, the person who won the Electoral College also won the most electoral districts.
Wow.
So congressional districts. So it would have changed one election outcome. But what it would do is it would make probably urban areas very important, because urban areas are areas where you can compete in terms of television and radio. You can compete there in terms of direct mail. You can compete there in terms of being able to walk the district. Like here in this district, this is a very walkable district. People can walk from door to door and campaign, whether they're in Dundee or whether they're in suburban Gretna. Mm-hmm. You can walk door to door, and there's voter databases that tell you who lives at every house. And so all of this can be very elaborately planned. It's a lot harder to do that in Saunders County.
Yeah.
There aren't as many people who live in Saunders County, and B, where there are clusters of houses, they're a lot farther in between.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So we clearly have, and you alluded to it way back in the early 1900s, a two-party system, and maybe you were alluding to, even though we had two parties, it seemed like maybe there was even a little bit more variety among those parties. And I think one of the big things, at least that crosses my mind every 2 years, but especially every 4 years, is how in the world did we get here? When we come to places and at large, you hear people saying, do we have other options? We've got two people, they're there, and we're like, are there better options? There have to be better options. We have, I don't know how many million people in the United States of America. Mm-hmm. There have to be better options to do politics and to find the most qualified candidates and get out of all the lobbying and all the money and all that kind of stuff. So question one is, how did we get here to at least the space that we're in now? Was it ever different, in the early 1900s and historically, and how did we get here now? And then question number two will be, I'll save that for a second. Like, can we ever get out of it?
Yeah. Well, the two-party system dates back to Washington's administration.
Okay.
There is nothing in the Constitution that says anything about political parties, but they began to develop, and they first developed in Congress, and they developed under the leadership of two people who were not in Congress. One was Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, mm-hmm. and the other was Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. And they just didn't agree. And the interesting thing is they both serve in Washington's administration. Washington really thought very highly of both of them, so he brought them into his administration, which is a very different kind of thing than what happened today. Today, it would be very rare that a president would bring people of such diametrically opposed positions. But Washington wanted to hear these positions. And so he brings them into his administration. But what each of them did was they extended their influence into the Congress, and then they also extended their influence into the news media at the time. And so if you go back and you look at campaigns and what is said about Thomas Jefferson by John Adams and his campaign after Washington decides to retire, and you see what is said about, I won't repeat it here, what they said about each other, but Jefferson said some terrible things about Adams, and Adams said some terrible things about Jefferson. So when people always come to me and say, why is the system so negative? Well, the system's always been negative in that respect. But that's politics. That's politics. It's, you're trying to make the other person appear less favorable than you are. Washington was really concerned about this. He wrote about it extensively in his farewell address and delivered that to Congress. And then pretty much nobody paid attention to it because Washington went back to Mount Vernon and went back to farming. So it's been around since the beginning of the political system. We've had really only four major political parties in the history of America. The Federalists and the Whigs sort of died out. And then, since the Civil War, it's really been the Democrats and Republicans. Now, we do have, the Democratic Party in the Civil War is not the same Democratic Party today, nor is the Republican Party of Lincoln the same Republican Party today. They're very, very different. And so every few years, they sort of go through a process of reinventing themselves. And so that's one of the things that we've seen under Donald Trump with the Republican Party is it's really reinvented itself. This is not the party of the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. It's not really even the party of Ronald Reagan anymore. This is now the party of Donald Trump, and that's why there are some people who, they're looking at the old Republican Party and they're struggling with this new Republican Party. But a lot of Republicans have just adopted it. They've just gone ahead and moved to it, and some of them actually prefer it. The thing I would say about third parties is while the Constitution doesn't specifically talk about political parties, it does talk about the kind of elections that we have. And so we have what are called winner-take-all elections. We don't elect 10 people to a district, which creates proportional representation. We have single-member districts, meaning like we have a member of Congress who wins one district, who wins one seat. Even our senators, even though there's two of them, they don't run consecutively or at the same time. And so so what ends up happening is you elect one for one seat at a time. You elect one president. And so what happens is your third parties sort of get pushed to the side when that happens. Because in the United States, we have what political scientists call unimodal distribution of voters, meaning most of our voters are more moderate and they're in the middle. So if the political parties are moving to that voter in the middle, they're trying to reach out to that voter in the middle because they've got to get majorities. They've got to get 51%. Then where does that leave room for third parties?
Yeah.
They're out on the extreme, and there are no votes out there. And so the real challenge is, with third parties is there's just no room for them in American politics. And, I remember back in the 1990s, Ross Perot made a very noble effort to run as a third party candidate for president, ended up getting 19% of the vote. He had a whole series of issues that he ran on. I remember one of them was lobbying reform, another is campaign finance reform, another is a balanced budget. And that was in 1992. Guess what's in the Republican contract with America in 1994? All those things. The Republicans just adopted them as part of their platform. And so did the Democrats, So it's not that third parties can't have an influence on the system, but in terms of winning office, probably not. The influence of third parties is going to be on influencing policymaking and influencing policy in the system.
So do you see a day where there is not a Democrat or Republican part? Are we just that kind of like you shared that they've transformed, they look a little different, they've evolved, but do you see a day where there's ever a possibility where there is not a D or an R as the two mainstay kind of political parties?
And unfortunately, I don't. I just don't see it happening. And by the way, I do like a whole unit on this when I teach a class. So I've given you and the listeners here just a couple minutes primer on it. But it's a common question that people ask. But the system is really designed to be a two-party system. And even the laws that we write are designed in such a way that it creates a two-party system. I mean, ballot access is automatically given to the political parties that ran in the last election. And new parties that want to get on the ballot, well, they've got a signature threshold they have to get across.
Yeah.
So the only way something like that happens is if one of the political parties dies. And if one of the political parties dies, then something will move in to take its place. This year we saw the No Labels Party. Remember the No Labels Party? Yeah, what happened to them?
Dead.
Yeah. I mean, they couldn't even find anybody to...
Didn't get a label.
Yeah. Well, they couldn't find anybody who wanted to run as their presidential candidate.
Yeah.
They tried to talk to Romney and Manchin and see if they would, run as a joint ticket. But no, they said, no, we don't really want to do it.
Yeah.
So, and most of that is because a lot of people perceive the stakes of government policy to be too high. And so they don't want to be the reason that somebody wins or doesn't win an election.
Yeah, I don't have any, I just have anecdotal data for this, but I would guess if I surveyed most people and said, do you think our political system of Democrats and Republicans is broken? I would guess most people would say, yeah, I think it's broken and I wish we could fully reform it and start from scratch, but obviously that's an impossibility.
Most of that is because the parties are so polarized today.
Yeah.
So most people, as I said, most voters tend to move toward the middle ideologically. But the parties are at the extremes. And so some of these congressional districts are drawn in such a way that they're electing people who are not in the middle. They're electing people at the extremes. And they can sort of operate out there at the extremes because they don't have fear of retribution or fear of losing their congressional seat. And that's on both the Democratic and Republican side. The bigger problem probably has to do with how we draw those congressional districts. If we could draw districts across the country that was more likely to put people in the middle, we'd have, instead of having 30 out of 435 competitive congressional seats, if we had 130, that would dramatically change the nature of politics in the United States.
Yeah. Is there a path towards that?
Well, I'll use Iowa as an example.
Okay.
Our neighbor, Iowa, uses a commission to draw their congressional districts, but in Nebraska, we still do it in the legislature with the approval of the governor. So if you can take the politics out of it and use a nonpartisan commission, which some states are beginning to adopt, then I think we could get there. But right now, the way the system is set up, out of 435 House seats, only 30 of them are really competitive. One of them happens to be here in Nebraska too.
Yeah. And has that historically been the case for Nebraska, or is that's more, within the last couple decades?
I've been here 25 years, and it's become more competitive since I've been here. It got really competitive probably starting about 2006.
Okay.
And I think that was a surprise for a lot of Republicans that it was so competitive that year. But a lot of it has to do with the changing nature of Omaha. Omaha is clearly becoming a more urban center. So it's attracting a different kind of demographic than it would have attracted maybe in the 1990s or the 1980s.
Yeah. I think the more I talk to young people, they're increasingly wanting to disengage with the label maybe of Democrat or Republican and being more thoughtful about, okay, I'm just going to label myself as independent. I don't want all of the baggage and all of the, stereotyping, everything that goes along with, my parents' political party in there. Are there advantages to just saying, hey, let me just label myself as independent so I can just choose?
That's something you can do in Nebraska. It's not as easy to do in other states.
Okay.
There's 270,000 people across the state of Nebraska who have adopted no label. In other words, they call themselves a nonpartisan.
Okay.
So that's actually a really high percentage relative to many other states.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of people doing it. Clearly, it's more than just young people.
Yeah.
But I know you're right about hearing it with young people because I work with college students.
Yeah. So I'm curious next about, we just live in a echo chamber type of world where news is everywhere. We can get news, access news quicker than ever. We can also access non-real news quicker than ever. There's probably as many fake news stations as there are real news stations, satire, all that out there. So in our polarized political climate, first of all, how can people engage in meaningful dialogue with people they disagree with? Like you were bringing up Washington, and he clearly had this hope of being able to dialogue and hear from two people that are diametrically in a lot of ways opposed to one another. How do we even do this where there's so much emotion built up? There's so much baggage, so much history. There's family lineage. There's so much that goes into this that it becomes a core part of many of our identities, I think, as Americans. How do we begin to strip away some of that to actually have fruitful, productive conversation? Because if we just start there, it seems like we'll never get fruitful, productive conversation.
Yeah, I would say first thing, I would put the phone down and stop looking at social media, because the algorithms in social media are sending you to people or organizations or businesses or products that are similar to how you already think. And so the term you used when you started the question was about echo chambers. And I see it with my students. I can tell who's in the conservative echo chamber and who's in the liberal echo chamber based on the response to questions like, what happened in politics last week. And I'll see that they'll come up with very, very different positions, or they may even talk about positions that the other side didn't talk about. So I would say the first thing we have to do is put down the social media. The second thing I would say we have to do is when we read a newspaper, and I hope everybody's reading a good newspaper. I mean, I think that is critically important, and it's a skill that we've lost. Television sort of took over probably 20 or 30 years ago as the main news source for most people. Social media is taking over as the main news source today. But I would put down the social media, and then I would read a good newspaper. But also, when you're watching television, remember that anything you see after 6 p.m. is opinion. It's not news. So if you watch the news, the news is one thing. Remember that a lot of the listeners probably won't remember Walter Cronkite, but Walter Cronkite gave us the news. He gave us the news in 30 minutes, and everybody listened to Walter Cronkite, and everybody trusted Walter Cronkite. But, when you turned on CNN when they started and you saw Crossfire and you saw Pat Buchanan sitting across the chair from, whatever liberal was on the other side, you realized that was opinion. Well, whatever you're seeing in the evening is somebody's opinion, and so that's where I think we get into a lot of because people are watching it when it's available to them, but if we want to read news, just know that news is different than opinion. Okay. So I would say put down the social media, pick up a good newspaper, and be attentive to what it is you're watching and when you're watching it, and whether you're listening to news on television or whether you're listening to opinion. And then once I think we do that, we can begin to have conversations with our neighbors. So if you've got a Trump sign in your yard and you have a neighbor who has a Waltz or a Harris sign in their yard, you can now go to the fence and start talking, because you have a common understanding of the way things have occurred. And I think that is critical. I think that's important. Now, first of all, I know that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's a dream. The world has changed in the last 10 or 15 years. And so we're probably not going to see that. But I would also just encourage people to sit down and have a conversation. Lots of times, I know that there are people that I disagree with, but when I sit down with them, I find out we have some things in common. I also hear what they have to say because it's a two-way conversation. As much as we like to think responding on social media with our thumbs is a two-way conversation, that's not a two-way conversation. What you're doing is you're telling somebody off. You need to have two-way conversations. That means you got to buy a cup of coffee, or you got to sit down and have breakfast. Or something like that. And I think that's the better way to do it. It's really sad, that there's a study that was done by a political scientist that shows that bowling is up in the United States, but bowling in leagues is down. So people are bowling alone. We shouldn't be doing these things alone.
Yeah.
We should be doing them with other people. We should be doing them in a community.
Yeah. And obviously, like me, somebody who gets to serve as a pastor, and I listen to this kind of stuff. I'm like, well, this is stuff that God made us to do. He made us in his image. He made us for community. He made us for those things. And I've also realized, and one of the things I talk about often here on the podcast is as I've grown older and hopefully more thoughtful and willing to engage with other people, realize that and a lot of the things that my positions have become more firm on, but the more I'm in proximity to people, the more my posture towards them begins to change. The more I'm able to see them as a human that I believe is made in the image of God, the more I'm able to see, man, they have all the same problems going on in their life. They have the same struggles happening in their life. Maybe whatever their vice is or whatever the thing that they're turning to that might be destructive in their life, I've got those too. They just look different. But the more I can interact and see that image of God in them, the more I can be in proximity to them and not understand them as just a voting block or a political talking point, but as a person, the more I realize, man, my posture starts to change for them. And I start to see, hey, they're not an enemy. Maybe some of their thoughts are victims of an enemy that wants to convince them of evil or whatever, but they're not an enemy. And the only way to do this together is if we build community, which is common unity, find those things if we want to find a path forward.
Yeah. If I could add to that too, I think one of the important things is empathy. I think that's what you were talking about right there. As you've grown in your faith and the longer you've been a pastor, you probably feel that empathy more. I was scrolling through social media last night and, it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Yeah. And I'm like, my wife had breast cancer. I have empathy for people in that situation. I have empathy for families. I have empathy for women in that situation. Unfortunately, it was probably created by my wife having breast cancer.
Yeah.
But those are the kind of things that we find out in community because we know somebody who's been through it or we've been through it ourselves.
Yeah.
And you don't do that when you're just like banging away with your thumbs on social media.
Yeah. And that's a great example. And that's the same. I've talked about this in the podcast for the deaf community. Until I had a daughter who was a part of the deaf community, it wasn't like I was uninterested in them, but I just was. I didn't have time. I didn't have a need to understand it. But once we do understand that, and now my whole family starts to understand that, we build this bigger community of people that have empathy and understanding, and you're able to do that. But at the same time, we cannot fully embrace that for every single issue that is in our world either.
You can't. But I think it starts with just having empathy and trying to understand where somebody's coming from.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Yeah. Help me understand is an important question that often we don't ask. Yeah. So the other question I have is, you talked about this a little bit, the difference between news and opinion. And there's so many news sites out there or opinion sites out there that are telling us they are news. So how do we figure out really if I want to go somewhere just for news that has as much of the bias filtered out as possible? Are there places that you would recommend? Are there certain, you talked about a time, before 6 o'clock. Are there other tools that if you're like, I just need to fact check something as, a political science person and figure out cutting through all the fluff and all that, where do I guess you go to actually sort that out when your students are like debating about it and you're like, no, but there's real facts involved here?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is, first of all, I go to multiple sources.
Okay.
If I'm doing something like that. So I don't rely on just one source. A lot of people will, I tell my students this all the time, don't rely on Wikipedia. Wikipedia might be right, but it might not be 100% right, and it could be completely wrong. Mm-hmm. So, and then I always like to, as a good researcher, trace the footnotes. Obviously they got that information from somewhere. Can I validate it with, 2 or 3 different sources? When I see it, there are fact-checking organizations out there like PolitiFact. They'll do that. They usually do it around, like a TV ad or a political event, like a debate or something like that. So they'll do those kind of things. But I think the more important thing is to think about the news sources you're watching, the news sources you're reading. And, if you think about news is not, it's plural. It's not singular. And so in the one sense, if we were to plot news and we would put all the news organizations on a sheet of paper from the top to the bottom, we might say, okay, well, are they giving us straight news or are they giving us opinion? So at the top, it might be straight news, and at the bottom, it might be opinion. And then across the bottom of the sheet of paper, it might be, liberal to conservative. So, so you could have, straight news that has a liberal tint to it or a conservative tint to it, or it might even be in the middle. And you could also have, news that is more opinion that is liberal or conservative. And I think it's important to recognize not just are you watching liberal or conservative or listening to liberal or conservative news, but are they giving you the opinion or are they giving you the facts? And maybe they're sprinkling a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But it's to recognize when are they doing that?
Yeah.
And how does that come across? Because I think overall what you want to do is you want to collect lots of information and be able as a good political consumer to evaluate that.
This all seems practical, simple, but not easy. It's like I know how to be more healthy, right? I know the right diet to be on or the right things to consume and not consume. But how do we go from, okay, this is simple, I know the recipe, the ingredients, but how do we actually start to like put this together? Like as you talk to students maybe that walk into your class with probably a lot of bias and a lot of, I grew up in a house, I do all this, like how do you maybe try to help walk them through that process to like end of the semester maybe be better at understanding some of these things?
Yeah, I don't know there's a good way to do that. I mean, they say avocado toast is really good for me.
Okay.
And I like toast a lot, but I don't like avocados.
Yeah.
So I never eat the avocado part. I don't even put it on the toast. But I don't think there's an easy way to get at this, Alex. I think it is. You have to take an opportunity. Everybody needs to take an opportunity Democrat, Republican, independent, young, old, male, female, and just step back, and just say, what's going on here? I'm going to put on my evening news analyst hat, and I'm going to really sort of try to figure this out, because these are, some of these questions are important. And right now we're probably going to take a couple of the most important votes for president, member of Congress, U.S. Senator, initiatives on the ballot here in Nebraska that we're going to take in our lifetime. These are going to have big consequences for a number of years until we try to change them again, probably. So I would say, take a moment, sit back, be thoughtful, and I would also say, for those of us, who are listening who are Christian, I think it's good to pray about it. I think it's good to sort of ask for God's direction and listen. God may not tell you anything. I'm not sure that God is saying, Alex, this is exactly how I want you to vote.
Yeah.
God probably knows how you're going to vote.
Some people have told me that he's told me how I should vote, but I haven't heard it for myself yet. So.
Yeah, but God may already know how you're going to vote, and so he doesn't have to tell you.
Yeah.
He might be telling somebody else. But I do think that, God has a plan. And when you're casting 100 million plus votes, is God influencing that in there somewhere? Probably. Mm-hmm. I'd be surprised if he's not, So, but whether it's you individually, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I think that's so good to take those steps back. And a lot of times ask, is it worth it, right? Like, is my relationship with my mom or my dad or my sibling or coworkers or all of these things, when we get caught up in the emotion, I think God gave us emotions. He gave us these things. And sometimes I think instead of putting them in the passenger seat where they belong to help steer us and say, hey, maybe you should turn right, maybe you should turn left, we let them be the Uber driver, and emotions and all those things often will just drive us to places we never intended to go.
Yeah.
And when it has to do with politics and these things that are near and dear to our hearts, and we attach our identity more than we should to some of these things, it can take us to a lot of places that we regret. And, a lot of places that after, the first weekend of November, you've got to do a lot of damage control maybe for the next 4 years because of the things you said, or the conniving, things you said, or the conversations you were unwilling to engage in. So I do think walking back and asking, praying about it, maybe the prayer is just creating space. Yeah. So you don't say that thing at that time when you're emotionally charged is
and
so
also
important.
Remember too that you got Thanksgiving coming up right after the election. Yeah. And everybody's got an Uncle Norman and an Aunt Blanche. Yeah. And they don't agree with the rest of the family. Yeah. And that's okay. Yeah. Because in the end, you're all family. Yeah. In the end, you're all Americans. Yeah. And in the end, if you live in Nebraska, you're all Nebraskans. Yeah. So, you do have a lot of things in common. And, some of these questions that we're going to be dealing with the next few years, what the world is going to look like, these are big questions. These are really, really big questions. On foreign policy, on economic policy. So I would encourage everybody to just, take some time and think, what do you feel like the world should look like?
That's so good. Well, I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's fascinating to have this dialogue and just helpful, I think, to understand some of the history and just, I've been always confused. Like I said, I've lived in Nebraska and I hear that we're different, but even shedding some light on some of those things is helpful for someone that actually knows. And so any other piece of advice or ways that you would encourage people to stay informed before we sign off today?
No, just, I would say everybody should just be paying attention to the news. If you're going to vote early, vote by mail, go ahead and get your ballot in. And, I would recommend to people, I think voter turnout in Nebraska is going to be really high. So, if you're going to vote in person on election day, expect or plan for having to wait in line for a little while.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you again. And thank you all for listening to today's episode. If you've got any questions you want to talk to us about or suggestions of what else we should talk about, you can always email us at podcast@ccco what is it? cccomaha.org. There it is. Or you can find us on Instagram, TikTok at CCCOMA podcast. Leave us a voicemail. You can give us your opinion, even if it's not fact or the news, at 402-885-9930. Until next time, we will talk to you then.